When you say Railway King, especially in the north, many enthusiasts conjure up visions of the old King of York, his rise to power and his eventual downfall when the railway bubble burst, leaving him a broken man and on the run from the law. But history tells us of another, a man from Manchester whose power and influence would rival George Hudson himself. Edward Watkin was born in 1819 near to what would be Victoria Station to Absalom and Elizabeth. The family was moderate by Victorian standards, and Edward was the youngest of 5. Edward was very close to his father, and this close relationship helped shape Edward's life. Absalom strived for political reform, especially supporting both the poorest and enslaved people in society. His business was one of 11 that refused point blank to sell cotton that had been through the hands of slaves, a big thing considering cotton was a primary mover in Manchester. Closer to home, he was appalled of the working conditions of the lower classes. The majority were local farmhands that had left their family homes looking for work in the growing cities. What greeted them was squalor. Factories offered men work, but the homes they also provided were rancid, disease-filled holes with no running water, where several families scrambled to find a place on the floor to sleep. In Absalom's eyes, the rich got richer on the misery of the many, and it simply couldn't stand. Unfortunately, the majority of the upper classes didn't agree with this view and labelled the poor into deserving and undeserving. It was their fault they were poor, so why should they receive any benefit? Sadly, this view landed thousands into the many workhouses up and down the country. Absalom rose to power, becoming the leader of the Anti-Corn Law League. No one was prouder than Edward. The League forced down the price of bread, saving thousands on the poverty line from starvation. The campaign would ultimately succeed, but it was at a cost. Absalom would retire from public life. For his supporters, this would be a shock, as he was a shoo-in to be the next MP, but the fight had drained him mentally, and he moved away from Manchester's industrial heart to Northumberland, to the sanctuary of the country. Edward, compared to many, had a privileged upbringing. He had a decent education, and his father would treat his family to several outings, including taking the 11-year-old Edward to see the first timetabled passenger railway from Liverpool to Manchester. That day cemented something in Edward, and a love of railways began to develop. He had his first taste of public office in 1835, when he was assigned as a check clerk for a by-election. When the Anti-Corn Law League was launched, Edward wanted nothing more than to be a part of it. Like his father, sitting by while people suffering was not going to happen. While Absalom challenged the laws with logic and reason, Edward brought the energy and the zest. His positive attitude brought the people in, but his father was cautious. Although the new generation wanted change, it was the older, more conservative generation that held the power. Going in bouncing was not going to work, and the twin approaches often came to a head, often with a lot of arguing. But Edward's efforts would see rewards. Because of his work, he would see himself elected to national chairman of the Operative Association, with his role mixed between holding conferences and speaking at meetings. His goal, similar to the Anti-Corn Law League, was better opportunities for the poorest working, while improving conditions. He also advocated for public parks and Saturdays off for workers, to which 500 businesses agreed, and £19,000 was raised towards the project. His management skills had also got him noticed, not in politics, but in railways. The Trent, Valley, Midland and Grand Trunk Railway needed a secretary to run its new venture, and Edward fit the bill nicely. He was only too happy to accept, but even though he was on the podium every other week and he loved the job, he despised public speaking. He hated it with a passion, and with family troubles at home with illness, he was grateful to get a job that took him out of the spotlight. He asked for a short break before he started, and the company obliged. The reason? He was getting married. He met Mary at another wedding and the two hit it off. The wedding was followed with a short honeymoon, and the pair moved to a home in Oldham. A year later he was blessed again when Mary announced she was pregnant. Edward struggled to juggle both family and his working life, but 6 months after he started, the railway was absorbed by the London and Birmingham Railway. When this happened, and it happened a lot, then those that had shares in that company would be due a large payout, split between them. The division of the payment lay, in this case, with Edward. It was so stressful it caused a full-blown panic attack for fear he had messed them up. He went rather quiet after that, but he was also offered an administry secretary 3 months later when the London and North Western Railway absorbed London and Birmingham. Told you it happened a lot. After a brief stint in USA studying railroads and politics, he came back with a renewed vigour. He was appointed general manager of a new line, this being the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire. The line wasn't too massive that Edward would struggle, but not too small that he wouldn't be unchallenged. To help give him further incentive, the more profit he made, the bigger his salary would rise. Within a year of his employment, he was asked to help with the Grand Trunk Railroad of Canada, the largest railway in the country at the time. He declined citing work here, but the directors kept pursuing. He was very good at getting people out of trouble, and the railroad was in dire straits. Besides, with the birth of his son, followed by the birth of his daughter, he was a family man now, and didn't want to uproot he had already placed. He also had a place potentially waiting in Parliament, and unlike his father, he couldn't pass up the opportunity. The campaign was a success, and he won a seat in the Yarmouth by-election. The seat, though, was short-lived when the election result was contested. Turns out some of Watkins' supporters had been a little bit naughty and had found to be offering bribes to other electors for Watkins' support. Watkins would be found innocent, but the action caused him to lose his seat and some of his reputation. He wouldn't stand again for a further 5 years. Unlike the rules of today, Edward was allowed to stand for 2 seats at the same time. He stood for Stockport and the West Riding of Yorkshire, and to his surprise he won both. He was forced to concede one of them and chose to drop Stockport. He held the other seat for a decade. In 1857 he then applied for the Hythe seat, which he would hold for another 20 years. Clearly the public liked him. Now you might be thinking, where's the railway in all of this? Well, it was still there. And like many MPs, Edward held several senior seats with railways, including the South Eastern Railway, and he had big ambitions abroad. But before he could even get his MP seat warm, the Grand Trunk contacted him again, only this time they were in real big trouble. In 1861, he was approached by the British Cabinet to help with the occupation of Canada. He was also asked to help again with the Grand Trunk. By now, the railroad was almost bankrupt, and its supporters and shareholders admitted the Grand Trunk was a hopeless case, its profits gone to greed, politicians and waste. The railroad pleaded and begged, and with a push from the cabinet and seeing it was crucial to the governance of Canada, Edward accepted. Edward first took stock of the mess. Corruption was found at the highest level and overspending was rife. He cut out the majority of the force, and this also included inventor Thomas Edison, whose experiments cost his boss an expensive oak desk. Within a year, he not only broke even, but he had turned a 60% profit. His efforts promoted him to president, and his role was instrumental in creating the founding states. His reward was a knighthood from a grateful queen and kingdom. But it was a bittersweet victory. As he accepted the role, his beloved father passed away. The 1860s, though, were the glory days for Edward. He loved to travel, and although the trunk railway was of high importance, so was his duties back home. He travelled to all 4 corners of the UK giving advice and help, and travelled to America no less than 30 times. Not bad for a time when there was no planes. His reputation was only matched by his private carriage. Because he spent so much of his life travelling, the carriage was kitted out with everything he needed. When he arrived, he was keen to listen. If he heard an idea he liked, he would endorse them, even if it was a rival. According to those that met him, He presented himself with an upper-class pride that was pleasant and sometimes very funny, occasionally cracking jokes in a light-hearted manner. His power, though, did give him some rather grand ideas, one of which would not be realised for over 100 years. He had dreamed of seamless travel between England and France, and the only way to do that in his eyes was a tunnel. It would be the longest tunnel in the world at 22 miles. He drew up surveys, got permission, bought a drilling machine, and in 1880 set to work drilling around 200 foot a day. But as he set to, Parliament began to fret. The French were planning to meet Edward with a tunnel of their own, and while the British was the most powerful nation in the world at the time, thanks to its vast empire, it wasn't keen on other countries coming in. With the French wars a generation behind them, the losses still hit home. There was a murmur also of invasion. Edward proposed security measures, even going as far as destroying the tunnel should the worst happen. In the end, bowing to both public and economic pressure, Parliament halted the work and the scheme was abandoned. In 1988, ironically, the Eurotunnel machines found and cut through the original tunnels, and the engineers confirmed that if Watkin had been told to continue, he most likely would have succeeded. The failure of the tunnel seemed to be a turning point for Edward. His old friends distanced themselves from him, and he noted his words carried less weight than he was used to. Still, he pressed on with his ideas. Inspired by the new Eiffel Tower, he purchased and built Wembley Park, and wanted to build a tower to rival France's. However, when the tower was just under 50 metres tall, the company building it folded. Edward had no choice, he had to stop. And it was a good thing too. It turned out that the tower was no match for the London Clay Underground, and the tower developed a list. It was so bad that it was condemned, and the tower was eventually removed in 1907 and sold for scrap. The park was eventually refurbished, and a new stadium was built shortly after, once they sorted the clay. But while his projects were ambitious, no one could deny his brilliance in railways. He turned several companies around and saw the transformation of the Great Central Railway. He even convinced the bosses at Lords to agree to a tunnel under their sacred pitch and monitored the construction personally. But his health and his work was beginning to catch up with him. His beloved wife Mary died in 1888, and he was so distraught he wrote her memoir in her honour and paid homage to her in a local church with 6 new stained glass windows. In 1892 he married a widow called Anne. They were old friends and both were happy in each other's company. Sadly, their love would not last long. Edward took ill in 1895 and was forced to retire, and Anne would pass away a year later. He would retreat from public life, and on the 13th of March 1901 he passed away at home from old age and exhaustion. Edward was a visionary but a complicated man. Some would say a man of dreams, but he passed seemingly broken from what people would call Watkin's follies. Yet I'm sure that in 1991 he was looking down having the last laugh, seeing the French and English workers exchange handshakes and flags as his folly was finally realised.